Gargi, you can start, please.
Okay. Thank you so much, Rajiv. Still, I am clearly audible. Rajiv, please confirm. Am I clearly audible to all of you? Rajiv, can you please confirm me?
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Yes, ma'am.
Okay. Good evening, everyone present here. Respected speaker, Professor Marta Arzarello, our principal of our college, Professor Alka Singh ma'am, our senior most colleague, Dr. Sheila Singh ma'am, our departmental in charge, Dr. Shushila Bharti, and colleagues and other eminent scholars, if anybody present here, and dear students. I am Dr. Gargi Chatterjee, a faculty of Department of AIHC and Archaeology of the college. I welcome you all on behalf of the team Quest of Past for the special lecture entitled New Data about the Lower and Middle Paleolithic Occupation of Europe. So, most of us as a teacher, when we teach about world prehistory, and as a part of it, we teach the prehistory of Europe. So that time we always talk about the traditional data, like we always talk about Acheulean phase, Mousterian phase. But what about the recent data? So we are very fortunate enough that we have Professor Marta Arzarello with us, who is working on the field of prehistoric Europe for a very long time. So I welcome her from the core of my heart, and I wish to share a brief introduction of Professor Marta Arzarello with you people. She is a professor of prehistoric, protohistoric, archaeology and anthropological sciences and zoology at the University of
years ago. Of course, this site in Georgia, and of course, again, it's a an ideal date because you know better than me that the occupation of Asia, in particular Southeast Asia, is older than this date. So according to the occupation of Asia and only after the occupation of Europe. And this conventional date at 1.8 is corresponding to the crossroad, the site that we consider at the crossroad of Europe and Asia, so the site of Manisi. This period of time, it's poorly known, and of course we have in some kind of lack of data. We all know that the first evidences of lithic industry correspond to 3.3 million years ago in Africa. We know that the first lithic industry have not been produced by Homo genus, but by Australopithecus, according to our actual data, because the oldest lithic assemblage in Africa were never been found in association with Homo remains. And so we can see that there is a huge gap between what happened in Africa and what happened in Europe and in Asia. And we will see this gap during all the lower Paleolithic, because we have 1 million years of gap, even more, for Olduvaian, so the first culture of lower Paleolithic, and 1 million years old of gap also for the Acheulean. So we can see there is something that we have to think in deep. Culture from Africa, where all of them are burning, for lower Paleolithic, because after we will see that we have more local evolution of industries, and so between Africa and Europe. We have already seen last time, I have made a lecture for Quest of the Past, that the site that characterize the lower, very lower Paleolithic in Europe are very few. It means that when we try to do theories, we have very few data, and it means that it's quite complicated to really make comparison. Also because you know very well that to really have information about the prehistorical occupation, and this is valid, more valid for the oldest occupation, we need a lot of data in the same site. We need stratigraphy, we need environmental condition, we need a precise chronology, and it's not always the case for the site that you can see that. But the first question, and the question that we are more taking into account in this day, is why Homo go out of Africa and in which environmental condition. All the sites that you can see here in the map are dating more or less in between 1.5, if we exclude Manisi, but it's dated to 1.8. So here, the Western Europe has been occupied between 1.5 and 1 million years ago. So, of course, we cannot define a general climate for 500,000 years, but we can try to see if the climatic condition has influenced the diffusion of the Homo out of Africa. By the paleoanthropological point of view, we don't know exactly which species is in that moment in Europe, because in Manisi there is a new species that has been defined, that is the Homo georgicus, but this Homo georgicus is a puzzling species because it's a mosaic of character. We have very archaic character in some kinds that can be assimilated to Australopithecus, but we have also more evolved character. And for Western Europe, basically, we don't know which species because we found very, very few human remains, even if we have time to find more in the future. And so we don't know which is the species. So we just tell that Homo georgicus has been found at more or less 1.8 in Georgia. And why this site of Manisi is so important? Because we have a wonderful chronology. And as the site is included in between basalt levels, we can use radiometric methods to date it very well. And so this is maybe the only ancient site with a so precise, so clear datation made by several methods. This is why we are considering generally the oldest site out of Africa, even if in Asia, you know better than me, in Southeast Asia, we have sites that are dated to more than 2 million years ago, but not so well dated. So here we have one species that we will not find in any other country, the Homo georgicus, and this is the problem for this period, that we have tendencies for the older period. Each site has a species and a new name is given. It will be the case of Homo antecessor for Cima dell'Elefante, for the Sierra de Atapuerca Grandolina site. So one site, one species. And as we know, the concept of species in paleontology is not corresponding to the biological concept of species. The biological concept of species, as stated by Dabowski and Meyer, is saying that we can consider two individuals from the same species if they can interbreed. But for prehistorical time, of course, we cannot verify interbreeding. So we are using a paleontological concept of species. And in that case, it's quite hard to redefine the morphological variability of the species. Another important thing concerning Manisi, behind the human remains, of course, is that we have a technology that it's very similar to the one that we found in Africa at more than 2.5 million years ago. So how we can think that something is not evolving for more or less more than 1 million of years. Another example going, and we will take just this example for the first population of Europe, just to give you the idea about what we know today concerning the environmental condition in the side of Pirro Nord. Unfortunately, it has not been possible to date the site of Pirro Nord by radiometric methods, even if we have found everything, but there are not volcanic minerals, and so it's not possible to use, for example, methods like potassium argon or argon that are the better way to date this kind of site. We have not data with a paleomagnetic signal, and so basically Pirro Nord has been dated only on biochronological basis. This site is the east side, is located in southeast Italy, and this is important because imagine that here, more or less, there is Manisi. So, of course, the fact that this is the older site in Europe, after Manisi, of course, it means that probably the migration from Africa to Europe, as also it's plausible according to the fact that Asia was occupied before Europe, is coming from the east. And so we can imagine a movement of the population from the east to the west of Europe. And of course, this is the geological map of Italy around 1.5 million years ago. Of course, this part of the sea was covered by land, and so probably the Homo have not made this kind of tour, but just crossed from the east to the south Italy. The site of Pirro Nord is located in an active quarry, and this is complicated a little bit the things, but the interesting thing is that all the finds have been found inside a calcium fixture in a complex that is characterized by final Miocene and Pleistocene fissures. The Miocene, final Miocene fissures are dated to about 7-5 million years ago and are characterized by an endemic fauna. It means that at that time, the Gargano promontory, so this is the Gargano promontory, was an island. And so those fissures are filled by sediments corresponding to what we called microsia fauna. So all the species are endemic. And of course, as endemic species are going to giantism and insular nanonism. But some of the fissure has been filled at the end of the Philofrankian. It means between 1.6 and 1.3 million years ago. Pyrenoid is a chaotic accumulation of sediments, bones, and lithic industry, so it's almost impossible to define a real stratigraphy. But this is not a problem, because we are considering that the infilling of the sediment inside the fissure, it was something like a more or less immediate phenomenon. Of course, when we are saying immediate phenomenon, we are talking about the geological scale time. So we say made in a very short period, but of course not 1 or 2 days. So if we want to know how this kind of occupation has been done, basically the Homo was living somewhere near, very near to the fissure. And we say very near because the lithic industry and some of the bones don't show any high transportation alteration. After, of course, the Homo leave the site and the water bring inside the fissure sediments and whatever was in the site. And thanks to this phenomenon, today it has been possible to find one of the oldest sites in Europe. I think there is a question. Okay, sorry, no. Okay. So Pyrenoid is very important because we have a huge faunal assemblage composed by more than 20 species of amphibian and reptile, 40 species of birds, and more for 40 species of mammals. Between them, we have carnivores and herbivores. And now it was quite complicated at the beginning to make the relationship between the human activities and the natural activity. I mean, if animals were died because they had to die, or died and exploded by Homo. And thanks to the study of the bones, we know today which is the relation between bones and lithic industry. But before to see it, just some more precise consideration about the chronology. The biochronology has been done, of course, on the large faunal assemblage, but basically on micromammals remains, and especially on the evolutive degree of Alophaeomus rufoi. That is a small mouse. You can see the teeth in the picture here. And according to evolutionary degree of Alophaeomus rufoi, we know that the Pyrenoid site is corresponding to the site in Spain of Ventimiglia, but it's a paleontological site. And we also know that it's the oldest site of Europe. But our initial question was, why men go out of Africa and in which condition? It's quite hard to say why they was going out of Africa. Today we are thinking that it can be, by one side, demographical pressure, means we are too many to stay there, or it can be also a climatic induction of this movement, or it can be also a movement following some of the predators, because of course we know that at that time Homo were not active hunting, was not making active hunting, but it was more doing scavenging. So the environmental reconstruction, according also to the study of Pyrenoid about the orbital parameters, so including all the data altogether, we know that between 1.3 and 1.6 million years ago in the Italian peninsula, there was an important forest reduction and expansion of open areas. And we will see that in this period, all the sites are characterized by this environment. And maybe probably this kind of environment have favorized a lot the Homo excursion from out of Africa, because they was looking from an environment similar to the one they were used to. Because of course, if you bring the same technology, you probably need the same environment to use that. And if we briefly describe the lithic industry of pyrenoids, again, we are very similar to what we are finding during the Olduvaian of Africa. So it's basically short reduction sequences finalized with production of flakes, mainly obtained by an opportunistic method. Even if in pyrenoid we have some important example of a centripetal debitage, but it's mean that at that time there was already a clear idea about how we have to organize raw material in order to obtain what we want. We were used to say that the only predeterminate method was the Levallois, and of course after the laminar method. But if we are going in deep in this concept, we will see that each flake has before a predetermination. The only things that you have to see, which is the technical investment I need to do my flake. If I want to do something fast, of course, I will use a simple reduction sequences. But each flake I obtain, of course, it is in some kind predeterminate. Because when I knap, I always know what will go out from my gesture. And so I just said before that now we have a clear idea about the connection between lithics and fauna, because in the pyrenoid we have found several cut marks that are giving to us important information again for the general picture of the first European poppling. We know that in most part of the case we have seen, there is a double access to the carcasses before the carnivores and after the Homo. And this is, of course, a signal of the fact that Homo was scavenging some herbivores already killed by other carnivores. Probably here we are talking about Pachycrocuta. What does it mean? It means that the scenario which we are now defining better and better in Europe, by the behavioral point of view, seems to be very, very similar to the one we are used to see in Olduvaian of Africa. So, generally speaking, what we have in there, an open area with temporary bodies of water, of course. Water is always very important for human occupation. We have local raw materials, so the Homo was installing themselves in a place where they can more or less everything near them. It's like if today we was going to live in a mall. And we also know that the Homo has a secondary access to the prey. And this, it's an important data, because for Europe, this is the only site that really attests us this kind of behavior, even if probably it's applicable to all the other side. And of course, the knapping methods are mainly adapted to the morphology of raw material. And this is a behavior that we can see in Africa and that we can see in the other European site, attesting the first European poppling. If we want to make a general picture of what is the first poppling of Europe, and if we take different data into consideration, in a difference of what we was used to see before, so everything is the same, we can see that there are really different characteristics. We have sites that are in open area and sites that are in cave. This means that we cannot say that there was preferred or not kind of home. We have most part of sites using just one kind of raw material, but at that time we have also sites using different raw material. So sometimes the Homo was exploiting only one rock, sometimes more than one. And this is not a question of availability of those raw material, because, for example, coming back to pyrenoid, the only raw material used was flint, but of course, we are in a limestone quarry, so the limestone was available a lot, but the Homo never explored it. In the other side of Fontanella and Barranco León, for example, here in southern Spain, that are dated to about 1.2 million years ago, it was using flint and limestone. So this is quite strange. After concerning the environment, we can see that we have different environment because we have open area with localized human environment. We have forest and grassland and grass and arid environment. Here the nine is some priest, and in some priest the chronology is a little bit younger than the rest of the site. You can see like a line, so we can assume for the moment, until when we will found other side, we discover other side, that the occupation it's more in the southern latitude, probably according to the fact that Homo was adapted according to his technological evolution to the more hot latitudes. And so you can see that also by the point of view of the environment, we have very different behavior. So if you want to today, according to what we know, and of course we hope to find more sites in the future, because it's very, very important to enlarge the data. I remember you that 20 years ago, all the researcher was, 40 years ago, not 20, all the researcher was convinced that the occupation of Europe was not older than 700,000 years old. And now we have 101 million. So probably in the future, it will be possible to change again this scenario with the increasing of the data. So today what we can say? We can say that the first evidence of Europe occupation are dated back before 1.5 million years ago. And at that time, we really start to have a quite important occupation. It's not a sporadic presence of a man. By a general point of view, most part of both sides was in open area and in dry condition, something that is very similar to what to see to Southeast Asia, to the near Asia, where the Homo passed, and to Africa. And concerning behavior, we have always the exploitation of local raw material in terms of lithics and fauna. The same is for Africa during Oligocene. The only problem that we have, a difference than Africa, is that in Africa we have a quite clear definition of Homo evolution at that time. We have information about the different species. In Europe, we can talk only about Homo sp. And concerning Western Europe, we need to wait until more than about 800,000 to have one defined species, that it's the Homo antecessor found in Grandolina. But here again, the Homo antecessor has been found only in Grandolina, so we cannot know so much about this species. We hope that the increasing of research will allow us to define a species, because this chronology is fundamental to define who really occupied Europe as first. And here in the picture, you have only remains dated back to more than 1 million years, that are the one of Gaudix-Pasa, the chief upper, and the one of Cima dell'Elefante in Atapuerca. And of course, from both kinds of materials, it's not possible to define a species, but it's only possible to define that it's genus Homo. You all know that at one time in Europe we passed after to the what we call Motu or Acheulean. The question is, the Acheulean is a local evolution of lithic industries, or is corresponding to a second out of Africa? Of course, today everybody is more thinking about the fact that Acheulean is arrived in Europe with Homo heidelbergensis. And this it was perfect until when we was considering that the first Acheulean in Europe was around 600,000 years ago. But there is one site, there is la Strana del Zamborino e la Cueva Negra del Esqueleto de Río Esquipar in Spain. Here, not far from the Gaudix-Baza Basin, so where we have evidence of the presence of a Homo about 1.2, 1.3 million years ago. And in both sites, we have hand axes dated to 0.9 million years ago. It means 900,000. And it means 300,000 before, when we was normally considering arriving the Acheulean in Europe. But it's only one site, and it's only two hand axes, both one. So it's quite complicated today to really assume that Acheulean in Europe, it's really starting around 900,000 years ago, even because both hand axes is not being recognized during the excavation, but it's a recent re-evaluation, re-study of the material found in the two sites that allowed to recognize the hand axes, that were empirically well attributed by the stratigraphical point of view. But of course, this stratigraphical attribution, so to 900,000 years ago, it's related to the excavation documentation. We don't have anymore the evidence inside the site. But of course, everybody will agree on the fact that this is an hand axe and this is an hand axe. After, by a general point of view, we know that, generally speaking, in Europe, the hand axes are arriving 600,000 years ago. And at the same time, we have the arrival of Homo heidelbergensis. Homo heidelbergensis, it's the one who progressively become Homo neanderthalensis, acquiring the physical feature, but also the technical attribution of Homo neanderthalensis. So during the European Acheulean, we have a quite complicated situation because we part around the 12, before the AS12, but we have few sites, but well reparted by the geographical point of view, because we have sites from England to the southern Europe before the MIS-12, so around 600,000. And we have the persistence also after the MIS-12, all around Europe. And we can see a huge diffusion also in Arabic Peninsula. It means that the Acheulean, it's a phenomenon that spread quite fast. If we compare to what we have seen from the first European people, here we can see really problems of conservation. So we don't know if this picture of Acheulean, it's a real picture, or it's because it's easier to find both sides. And inside variability, we have a huge variability in Africa, and we have an even bigger variability in Europe. This is considered that finally, according to the high diversity of Acheulean, it can be also something like a phenomenon of convergence. Some hand axes are so different one to the other that it's really possible that they represent. Unfortunately, there are very, very few use-where analyses on hand axes. And when we will have enough use-where analysis on hand axes, if we will arrive to define some precise utilization of hand axes, I think we will progress also in terms of what really the Acheulean is. And maybe we will go further than the general assumption that the hand axes are couteau suisse, so it's something with a multiple function and so on. And basically, during European Acheulean, we have a lot of typology of hand axes. We have different uses of technique, because we have hand axes made by soft hammer, and hard hammer. We have handaxes made only by hard hammer. We have handaxes that show a very high preparation of the point and even not much interest in the preparation of the proximal part or in the border. We have handaxes perfectly shaped. And another in Europe, it's that when we have handaxes, in sometimes at the same chronology, we have sites without handaxes. And at the same time, there was still the same another population, the previous one, but as you remember, we don't know which was, staying there. So at the same period in Europe, we have the coexistence of two species, as we will see after for Neanderthal and Homo sapiens, of two species, one with a Schuleian tradition, technology, and one other with the Oldovian technology. This is very complicated to see. To say, we will never know until when we will not found a site at 600,000 with no handaxes and without Homo heidelbergensis, with someone else. But for the moment, the question is open. So we have two possibilities, or two populations of two different species with two different traditions, Acheulean and Oldovian, or the same population with no different technological tradition, but with different activities performed in the site. Because if we are looking into the general composition of the lithic assemblage of the site without handaxes dated around 600,000 years ago, we saw that the debitage composite is exactly the same than the one of the site with handaxes. So the only thing that's changed is the façonnage. And it could be related to a lot of things, including the functionality of the site. I don't make handaxes if I don't need them, or I don't make handaxes if I don't have raw material allowing me to do it. And at the end of the Acheulean in Europe, we assist a huge phenomenon, but it's the apparition, the founding, not apparition, of wood instruments. Just to remember you that in Schöningen and also in Löningen, at 400,000 years BP, we found instruments in wood. What does it mean? It means that finally the raw material used was probably very differentiated, but as the wood, it's very hard to be conserved in Schöningen and in Löningen. We are in anostic, totally anostic situation. So in most part of case, this kind of material are not conserved in the site. But it means that we are basing the characterization of lower Paleolithic, so Acheulean, Oldovian, etc., on only one part of the technological production, because probably wood was one of the most important raw material used, even because all hunting activity were performed with wood, not with lithics. We have any evidence of hunting instruments during the lower Paleolithic. All those objects were, according to what we know now, used only for domestic activities. And so basically the first hunting object that we have found in Europe are the Schöningen and Löningen hump. So if we want to resume in a very general way, what we can say about the lower Paleolithic of Europe? Well, basically, we can say that we have a first occupation around 1.8 million years ago, that we don't know the species who do it, that around 800,000 years ago, we have a first species that it's a Homo antecessor that we found only in Atapuerca, that produced lithic industry like the one characteristics of the first European poppling, and that around 0.6 we have a Acheulean culture corresponding to Homo heidelbergensis arrival. But this Homo heidelbergensis arrival is not sure to be the real engine for the Acheulean, because we have first, of course, sporadic appearance of Endaxes at 0.9 million years ago, and around 0.6 million years ago, we have cultures in Europe without Endaxes. Going to the Middle Paleolithic, of course, things are becoming more clear, our site become really Acheulean, but we have to say that we have not so many sites. We have very few between 0.6 and 0.3 million years ago. As you know, the Middle Paleolithic starts 1.3 million years ago, according to a decision of a researcher, because we are making start the Middle Paleolithic in correspondence of the appearance of the level 1 method that appears a little bit before 0.3 million years ago, but when this date was decided as the starting of Middle Paleolithic, it was 0.3. At 0.3, the situation is very complex, because if before we had very few species, so Homo heidelbergensis in Europe, Homo heidelbergensis in Africa, African Homo heidelbergensis has a lot of names in Africa, Homo erectus in Asia. When we start with the Middle Paleolithic, we have a lot of species, and this is why everything is more complicated. By a general point of view, we can never associate clearly, except for Homo sapiens, of the last Homo sapiens, a species to a culture. It means that different species was making the same culture, and the same culture was made by different species. This is very hard to be believed, even if we look at the modern era. And so maybe something is still missed there. Of course, the Middle Paleolithic has a lot of data, so I decided to concentrate my reflection only on very few cases, just to enlarge your vision and try to make you thinking about the real complexity of Middle Paleolithic. So this is just an example. You know that the Dordogne is this part, but it's one of the richest part in Europe of Middle Paleolithic. It's the place where port is defined as topology and so on. So now the picture that I show you, that you will see it again, it's the general idea about the situation of Middle Paleolithic, what we call Mousterian. Don't forget that Middle Paleolithic and Mousterian are not synonymous. We have a lot of culture during Middle Paleolithic, and Mousterian is one of them, and Mousterian it's related to the Homo neanderthalensis production. So, in that small area, we have all this kind of culture. But it's quite complicated to define what a culture is, because we are defining the culture on the basis of the characteristics of the lithics, of reduction sequences, and so on. And if we are going to 300,000 to 29,000 years ago, we will see that are in front of different kind of lithic industry that appears, disappears, the level where products are more or less present. So we are in front of a very complicated mosaic. And we have a lot of sites. The number of site presence from 300,000 to the end of MIS3 are incredible. It means that at that time, the population must be quite important if compared to the previous one, because of course we have not real data about the demography in prehistory. It's quite impossible to make a fiable reconstruction of demography profile, but we saw that we have a lot of sites. Sorry. And what does it mean? That in a very short period, because before For the lower Paleolithic, we was going from 1.5 to 300,000. So more than 1 million years. Here we are talking about 250,000 years, so a short period. We saw places with different characteristics. We saw an evolution of some kind of methods, as you can see here in the picture, but not always. We can see sites very near one to the other that have different technological characteristics. And the reasons of these different technological characteristics are not clear. Of course, it can be cultural, but it's quite hard to define that two populations living in the same place at the same time had so different culture, or it's just an imaging that we are not really imaging because we are studying only lithics, not all the behavior of Homo. We don't know nothing about what it was doing. We don't know when they was woke up. We don't know what they was doing during the day. We know just this kind of instruments. It's like one day someone will study your society in studying the pens you have on your desk. This is not your culture, of course. And another thing is that at the end of Middle Paleolithic, so since more or less 150 and after, we start to have a lot of species. And this is the things that must to make us thinking. Because before we was used to say Homo neanderthalensis after Homo sapiens arrived, and bye-bye Homo neanderthalensis. So we was seeing a progressive advancement of Homo sapiens, and the Homo neanderthalensis going to the west until when he died. But today we know that around 16,000 years ago, we have at least 5 species existing in Europe. We have Homo neanderthalensis, we have Homo sapiens, we have the Denisovans, and 2 ghost species we have still not found. So at that time, we have a lot of species who are living in a quite reduced area. Both species as interbreeding between them, because we have their DNA, even very few. And it means, of course, that it can be reflected by several cultures. And also it means that we are not so able to see the real differences between the culture. And recently, some months ago, a huge discovery was made, because before we was thinking that the relation between Neanderthal and sapiens was made in the Middle East, and after, in the Near East, sorry. And after we consider that the Homo sapiens start to become to the Western Europe and replace the Neanderthal. But as I told you, in February was published in Science a new discovery in the Mandrin cave in France. You can see it, okay? And in Mandrin cave, that is dated to 54,000 years ago, they have found level characterized by the presence of Homo sapiens. So this is the first evidence of the fact that 50,000 years ago, that's a lot of times ago, Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis, was already living in the same territories in Western Europe. When here of Neanderthal occupation, sapiens occupation, Neanderthal occupation. This is the first evidence of a real and clear interstratification between Neanderthal and sapiens. And of course, this discovery will allow us in the future to better understand which are the relationship between sapiens and Neanderthal. And of relationship will be more and more studies and the DNA studies. Today, we managed to have DNA information since a very old skeleton. Of course, with improving of methodologies, I hope in 10 or 20 years we will be able to extract very, very small part of DNA, and so to have more relationship between the different human kinds. And at that time, this information will also help us to understand the culture, because this presence of different species in this period, and the fact that we don't recognize them always by the technological point of view, must pose us some questions. And in Mandrin, the sites attributed to Homo sapiens are characterized, in this case, by typical Homo sapiens lithic industry. This is the reason why they try to reanalyze the Homo remains, and they defined that finally there was an inter-stratification inside the cave. And as I told you, this is the first clear example in the world of clear stratification between Homo neanderthalensis and Homo sapiens occupation. So, by a general point of view, if we want to resume what happened in Middle Paleolithic, well, from some point of view, it was easier because we say there is Homo neanderthalensis, but we had just seen that there is Homo sapiens, Denisovan, and other two ghost species. So, the Middle Paleolithic, it's a convention because we consider the beginning of Middle Paleolithic at 300,000 years ago, but we have some lower Acheulean, so lower Paleolithic site with Le Valois. At the end of Acheulean, we have a lot of site with Le Valois. So this is a big problem because we consider it as lower Paleolithic, but at the same time, we are considering 300,000 years ago, there is the Middle Paleolithic. So this again, it's a problem of words, and maybe it's a little bit restrictive to say lower Paleolithic, Middle Paleolithic. This was good before when you had so few information, but today when it's possible to define a more clear picture of lithic industry evolution, maybe we have to left behind the words lower, Middle Paleolithic, and so on. Of course, it's easy to learn, it's easier to understand each other, but they are boxes, and we know that culture is complicatedly fitted with a box. And during this Middle Paleolithic, we have a huge differentiation of the lithic industry, and it's quite hard to define if this differentiation is related to behavior, to chronology, to environment, to all of these factors all together, to some of them, and so on. And about 35,000 years ago, we are passing to Upper Paleolithic. But before, we already have some Homo sapiens incursion. We already have some Upper Paleolithic lithic industry. So here again, it's quite complicated to really use a precise chronology for Middle Paleolithic. Generally speaking, going up on time and with multiplication of dating methods, the more and more precise datation at the C40 and so on, finally we see that even for Middle Paleolithic, the definitions are not so pertinent because the variability is higher and bigger we was thinking before. And if we want to really resume what we have seen, I have written here just some short sentences with the intention to make you thinking about what we know, what we are using to say we know, and what we have to maybe thinking about. So during Lower Paleolithic, we have several human species, but very few culture. Oldovian and Acheulean. And in this case, I'm talking about the world, not just Europe. We have a very long chronology because the first lithic industries appears 3.3, and we are considered Lower Paleolithic until 300,000. And just to culture, Olduvaian, Acheulean. We have a huge territory because we have Lower Paleolithic all around the world, but everything it seems to be homogeneous, because also if you compare with Asia, we are considered that it's quite homogeneous in the industry. Of course, we have all the problem of the Mobius line and so on, but generally we are considered the Middle Paleolithic, Lower Paleolithic quite homogeneous. If we are looked to Middle Paleolithic, we have more or less one human species in Europe, in Africa, and in Asia, not the same one, but we have a huge quantity of culture. We have a very short chronology if we compare to Lower Paleolithic, but a lot of culture. We have a big territory with a high variability. So, of course, we can say from this assumption that we have still some problem, and we have to increase our research to really see what's happening. But of course, one thing that is sure that in this moment, we have to try to make characterization going out from the box and to try to define things, not always according to the big boxes that we are using, Olduvaian, Acheulean, and so on, Styrian, but we have to try to put in relation environment, humankind, and lithic industry, remembering that the lithic industry are just one small part of the Homo behavior. And I hope these questions will move you to try to look for bibliography about it and to study these kind of things. I thank you for your attention. And if you want, I can answer to your questions.
Thank you so much, Marta, for such a beautiful talk. I came to know about several new researches, new things, which I didn't know yet. And you explain the faunal development and the technological, morphological development, and also the development of how the occupation developed from Lower Paleolithic to Middle Paleolithic very clearly without one thing that related to each other. When we say transitional phase, we just think in our mind that this is a separate phase between the previous one and later one. So we need to rethink about these problems. And with this statement, I request to our participants, if there is any question, they may ask, they may write also in the chat box, and also they can unmute themselves and ask physically. Virtually, sorry. Even sometimes, Marta, I think that when we talk about tools, tool typology, we also restrict ourselves when we term those typology, like hand axe, cleaver, chopper, chopping, the pebble tools. So we restrict their function sometimes. I think so, because we have, if I take example of hand axe, we have different shapes of hand axes. They should not be like considered in a single terminology hand axe, because if we see the ovate type of hand axe, then their function should be completely different than those Malkukian or lanceolate type of hand axes. So we should rethink about everything. Sometimes I
of course you are right, and even we have to pay attention, but because some words are bringing confusion. When we say, for example, side scraper, it doesn't mean that it's for scraping activities. The same for hand axe. We have very, very few use word analysis on hand axes. So frankly speaking, we don't know. And for the moment, there is any kind of study that put in relation hand axe morphology and function. Probably because the hand axes have so many functions that each use is erasing the precedent use. But for the moment, we have no idea. So basically speaking, we don't know nothing about the variability of an index. We even don't know if a very nice long-term index is the same things, but it's a not nice one with just the point shaped. So this is a problem. But once again, we need a common terminology, because otherwise, if we give a different names, we will not understand each other. And at the same time, if we multiply the name, it will be more and more complicated. Of course, the user analysis is very important, but we all know that for old lithics, it's quite complicated to really make user analysis. It depends on the context, so the surface finding cannot be made by this way, and this is the reason why we have very few. But the words that we are used for prehistory are not enough. This is for sure the things. So we need something more, and also we need more clear comparison between the different parts of the continents, because we put in relation, of course, Europe, Asia, and so on, but we don't know always everything. For example, we know very, very few about the Middle Paleolithic of Asia, because this industry are evolving in a different way, especially in Southeast Asia. We have not Middle Paleolithic using bamboo. Yes, of course, but what there is during Middle Paleolithic? All the laminar debitage appearing very early in China is strange, but we don't know enough, and even for other part of the world. So I think we need to before have a better chronology, because we have not a good chronology, because we have always dates that are taking into account at least 20,000 years old, and so. But the future will bring us peace.
Maybe we will be successful to reconstruct all these problems. We have some questions, Marta. First is from Kishan Maurya. What is the difference between Homo sapiens and Homo sapiens sapiens? Do Homo sapiens sapiens exist?
No, because we was using Homo sapiens sapiens when we was using Homo sapiens neanderthalensis. So before we was considering that Homo neanderthalensis was a subspecies of Homo sapiens. So at that time we was using the subspecies neanderthalensis and sapiens. Now we consider Homo sapiens, Homo neanderthalensis two different species. Also, if we have Homo neanderthalensis DNA, and of course, if we have Homo neanderthalensis DNA, it means that we can interbreed with Homo neanderthalensis, but there is a huge morphological differentiation. So today, we only use Homo sapiens and Homo neanderthalensis.
Okay, next question is from Nisha.